Hello and welcome everybody to the talk series of New Voices, Women in History on Education. And today we've got Sarah Bonfirm. She's a PhD student and she works on Wollstonecraft, and she's at Unicamp in Brazil. And she's also a New Voices member and part of the project blog Mulheres na Filosofia. And she will talk today about Wollstonecraft, and I'll just hand over to you, Sarah, and it's so nice to have you here today.
Thank you, Clara. I share my screen. So first, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for Clara Caro's efforts in preparing these amazing series talks. I'm learning a lot. I'm delighted to be here today and also nervous. As she said, I'm a PhD student from Unicamp, Brazil. In my master dissertation, I have researched how reason works to emancipate women in Mary Wollstonecraft's Education of the Rights of Women. What I'm going to present here today is part of my master's dissertation and my PhD project. It is important to say that this conference is a work in progress, so I would be very pleased if at the end I could hear some of your ideas, thoughts, and anything that can add something and give me food for thought. Also, English is not my first language, so if anything is unclear, please just let me know and I'll try to make it more understandable. So today I have two aims. Present how Wollstonecraft portrays the experience of dependence in her early books, namely Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, Original Stories from Real Life, and Mary, a Fiction. The second is introduce alternatives that guide to emancipation and that are in the pages of these books, indicating Wollstonecraft's vindicatory position about women's rights throughout pedagogical books. My plan is, first, I would like to contextualize Wollstonecraft's life and work. After the contextual part, I'll enter the conceptual one. I'll shed light on the first principles and the idea of what a proper lady is in the 18th century. I think it's interesting to add that, different from my colleagues that presented before me, I am not interested in the epistemological part of her work, but instead I am interested in the political aspects of Wollstonecraft's works. After that, I'll go straight to the heart of my conference. The section that I call the experience of dependence. Here I set forth the experience of dependence as they appear in each one of the chosen books, demystifying that dependence is a woman's natural quality. Almost concluding, I introduce some ideas in Wollstonecraft's early books that can lead to women's emancipation. Then the conclusion and some research ramifications on the issue of dependence. So let's get started. Wollstonecraft was born in London in 1759, and she was a child of a middle-class family. As expected, she did not have a proper education. She attended school for girls where she learned arithmetic, geography, French, music, and dance. Wollstonecraft's connections with influential people and friends throughout her life were responsible for her intellectual flourishing. Although Wollstonecraft could not properly recognize the struggle she faced in her youth, she had some clues about the resulting oppression of it. Because her family had to work for a living, Wollstonecraft early started thinking about what she could do to escape compulsory marriage. Wollstonecraft's granddaughter's inheritance was not available for her, neither for her sisters. It was only available for her brother Edward. The alternative was to appeal to available female jobs, such as mistress, maid of company, and housekeeper. All these jobs have in common low social status and lower payment. However, for Wollstonecraft, being underpaid was better than being married. Long story short, after taking all jobs available for women, Wollstonecraft was hired as a professional writer. About her books. Wollstonecraft was a versatile writer. She wrote letters, children's storybooks, travel writing, romances, and philosophical treatises. All of them have the remarkable Wollstonecraft mark: the first person writing, education as an evergreen theme, female protagonist, irony, and the direct approach to who is the target of her criticism. Wollstonecraft is a self-taught writer who improves her writing at the same time as she develops works. Besides her writing, Wollstonecraft translated some German and French books and wrote book reviews to the monthly magazine Analytical Review, which she was one of the editors. In the following, I contextualize the early books and their contribution to think the experience of women in condition of dependence. The very first publication of Wollstonecraft is Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, with reflections on female conduct in the more important duties of life. It was released on 1786. In this work, we can notice the perennial themes of Wollstonecraft's work: women's intellectual development and the urge to reevaluate how women were treated and socialized in society. Using a reactionary framework, Wollstonecraft subverts it, presenting a new idea about what a proper lady should be. She recommends behaviors that were not very common to female readers, such as stating their own opinion about literature and not giving marriage so early in life. In other words, Wollstonecraft imagines other possibilities for female existence. The second book, Original Stories from Real Life, with conversations calculated to regulate the affections and form the mind to truth and goodness, was published in 1787. It is a children's book with tales that sketch out the education of two young girls, the sisters Mary and Caroline. Another important character is Mrs. Mason, the housekeeper responsible for girls' education. Mrs. Mason's role is to create situations to teach the young girls how to behave and pursue in case of distress. I can say in advance that she teaches Mary and Caroline to follow the path of virtue, even if it's difficult. Teaching girls positive virtues is the great innovation of original stories. The third book, Mary, a Fiction, is a romance with biographical elements. Beforehand, Wollstonecraft informs the readers that she attempts to develop a character different from those generally portrayed. In short, Wollstonecraft's aim in this book is to offer other femininity possibilities analogous to those she has experienced for herself. When she says a character different, Wollstonecraft forges a heroine who tries to go beyond the strictly feminine model. The main character is called also Mary, and she can discuss subjects such as politics and literature. Also, the heroine Mary loves to read and can recognize her limitations even when fighting against them. Mary, a Fiction could be read as an exemplification of Vindication of the Rights of Woman, meaning that Wollstonecraft explores what she was thinking about and planning for women through examples and situations. In the following, I continue to present some contextual facts that will help us understand the idea that I work on today, the experience of dependence. I'll explain the first principles to demonstrate how liberty is one of the cornerstones of Wollstonecraft's project that includes the improvement of reason and virtues in women's lives. To demonstrate that the condition of women is an injustice in rights of women, Wollstonecraft presents a principle which will guide her arguments for women's emancipation. The conceptions of reason, virtue, and knowledge compose what she calls first or glorious principles. Wollstonecraft understands reason as the simple power of improvement, or properly speaking, the power of discerning the truth. Virtue can be understood as the end goal of human rationality and distinguishes a person from another based on actions. Knowledge results from combining experience and the association of ideas that grow lifelong. Working together, these conceptions play an essential role in searching for the simplest truth. Wollstonecraft explains the principle in the following, and I quote, "In what does man's preeminence over the brute creation consist? The answer is as clear as that a half is less than the whole, in reason. What acquisition exalts one being above another? Virtue," with spontaneous reply. "For what purpose were the passions implanted? that men, by struggling with them, might attain a degree of knowledge denied to the brutes, whispers experience. End of quote. Establishing these conceptions, Wollstonecraft affirms that knowledge differentiates human type of development compared to animals. Similarly, virtue distinguishes some men from their peers. When humans refine their knowledge, the achievement of virtue is a consequence, and it has physical and moral impacts, both from a social and an individual point of view. Although Wollstonecraft uses the word principles in plural, I will consider them singular, as an unit, working in the same direction. This principle provides a basis for Wollstonecraft to construct her vindication universally and abstractly. She combines these principal elements to challenge the established social order. Society had failed to build parity between sex, and at the same time, it instigates other injustices, such as social and economic inequality. Interestingly, Wollstonecraft's approach to female liberty takes under consideration everyday problems. In my view, this is exactly the strength of Wollstonecraft's approach to liberty. She does not spare efforts to report the experience of the dependent to her readers. When Wollstonecraft sheds light on the human condition, especially about women, she reveals the fact of dependence that goes under deep social layers. For example, in the third chapter of Vindication of the Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft diagnoses that the habits taught to young girls lead them to sedentarism. The consequence is a weaker body due to a lack of exercise and movement since childhood. According to Wollstonecraft's observations, a weak body means a weak mind. What Wollstonecraft addresses is the type of woman that, instead of developing rationality and virtues, wrap themselves in bands and become slaves by their own sick and frail bodies. In this case, sickness gains prominence and becomes usual and prevails as an obstacle to the improvement of reason. Besides the constitution of female body, Wollstonecraft calls attention to the lack of autonomy since childhood. Since they are little, girls are always under supervision and they don't learn about self-conservation, which, according to Wollstonecraft, is one of their natural exercises of thought. Women are dependent because they learn it to be, just switching the dependence between their parents, tutors, and husbands. Women got stuck in this dependence cycle their whole life and are incapable of improving reason. Consequently, this situation keeps them apart from the possibilities of emancipation. Questions could be raised, such as how could women be free without proper rights and not knowing their duties? How could women be free without the proper ways to guarantee their economic viability? The hypothesis that arises from these questions is that women's social dependence results from the lack of education at home and school. Wollstonecraft's point here is that women didn't learn how to behave for themselves in situations in life that demand agency and problem solving. She is interested in guaranteeing women's rights and making women understand their duties. Also, when women live as dependent wives or daughters, they will never be able to live the experience of being free, neither their society. About the experience of dependence, Lena Haldenius has a significant contribution. The scholar emphasized that Wollstonecraft is a philosopher concerned with real-life issues. Haldenius sheds light on Wollstonecraft's concern about social vulnerability that keeps women apart from inheritance and stable, well-paid jobs. I quote Haldenius. Wollstonecraft explore, if you will, the phenomenological context of living unfreely by asking not only what freedom is, but also what is it like? What is it like to live at the mercy of another? What does that do to you? Wollstonecraft defends Republican principles, but believes that a true understanding of what is to be free, why anarchy is bad, and how inequality works can only come through experience. End of quote. What Haldenius calls the phenomenological content of living unfreely is the matter of thoughts and education, original stories, and merry fiction as a reward. Wollstonecraft does not work with suppositions or abstract scenarios. Quite contrary. In these books, Wollstonecraft portrays real situations that probably she closely observed or lived for herself. Also, she draws political consequences not only for women but also for society. In the following, I continue my conference plan and present how Wollstonecraft portrays women who live unfreely. First, I introduce two ideas very quickly, the proper lady stereotype and Rousseau's Sophie, as an example. These ideas are important for two reasons. They serve as a background standard to the model of women that Wollstonecraft addresses and present how this idea of a proper lady portrayed in theory books. So, whether in Thoughts on the Education, Original Stories, or Marriage Fiction, Wollstonecraft mobilizes issues that she would go deeper in Rights of Women, namely the female education, the association of ideas, and the consequences of the lack of reason improvement. Like the rational descenders, Wollstonecraft credits to education the principles of her metaphysical framework and the possibility of social change. In other words, alongside education, a revolution of female matters would create possibilities to build a fair society based on virtues. However, ongoing femininity models prevent women from achieving solid virtues. For example, dependence was considered a natural aspect of femininity, such as the proper lady idea. According to Mary Pulvey, the proper lady is a popular stereotype between the 17th and 18th centuries, disseminated mostly by conduct books. Some characteristics were considered inherently feminine, such as modesty and obedience. Besides that, proper lady had to follow a moral and a sensibility code, and her husband should keep her under this strict code. For example, in the first pages of Emile or On Education, Rousseau sketches an ideal proper lady named Sophie, a girl that soon will marry Emile. First, Rousseau describes the ideal woman to marry Emile as an obedient woman. In addition, Jean-Jacques Rousseau says that arguing for equality between the sexes is pointless because each one serves a specific end on natural plans. Among other things, Rousseau also states that man and woman must form a couple in which one part is weak and passive and the other is strong and active. Keep in mind this brief picture about Proper Lady and Rousseau's Sophie, where the dependence of women is pictured as natural. I'll present an example of each one of the books, early books of Wollstonecraft, challenge, prejudice, and misconceptions about women. Also, I highlight how it feels to be under other people's power. And I can anticipate that Wollstonecraft spared no effort to demonstrate how humiliating and degrading this experience is. First, let us look at the book Thoughts on the Education and see Wollstonecraft's approach to questions related to work and education for women. In the chapters of Thoughts on the Education, unfortunate situations of females fashionable, educated, and left without a fortune, and matrimony, Wollstonecraft portrays the real impediments that arise from the situations that are part of an ordinary woman's life. Let us analyze first the section about educated girls left without a fortune. Wollstonecraft addresses those girls educated according to fashionable but left without wealth or marriage. The consequence that Wollstonecraft acknowledges about these girls in this not so hypothetical situation is that they will probably remain single and need to search for alternatives for the cost of living. Regarding the possibility of earning a living for themselves, Wollstonecraft assumes that the jobs available to women, few are the modes of earning a subsistence, and those are very humiliating. These jobs that are referred as humiliating are housekeepers, company ladies, and mistresses, especially for those ladies that will work as maids or housekeepers in their relatives' houses. Wollstonecraft shows how embarrassing the situation can be and how it can contribute to degradation of women. The thing is that the kind of job has layers of dependence and requires that women remain in a permanent state of discipline that compromises their rational capacities. Now, let us look at the chapter Matrimony. Wollstonecraft begins the chapter with the following affirmation. Early marriage are, in my opinion, a stop to improvement. When she says that, she may refuse that marriage improves or it's a cornerstone to female existence. She endorses marriage in a proper stage of life, which is after the 20s. Marriage must not be at the center of female life and should not be the ultimate wish. The end goal of male lives, actually all human lives, must be their duty to develop the faculty of reason and improve it. When women marry too early in life, their education is overlooked. Thinking about that, Wollstonecraft raised questions such as how could women escape from an unhappy marriage when they do not even know how to raciocinate? Besides that, women deal with questions to get pregnant as soon as they marry. How could these women raise virtuous children when they are stuck in childhood? What I'm trying to say here is that Wollstonecraft is not against marriage, quite contrary. In Rights of Woman, she defends that family is a microcosm of the state, and what happens at home defines what can happen in the state. The domestic space of family is responsible for growing virtues that contribute to the virtue of the state. What Wollstonecraft thinks is that women should have the agency to act, including deciding if they want to marry or not, and marriage must be a path to improvement, not the end. We can conclude that besides the conservative framework of conduct books, Thoughts on the Education presents a progressive position on the development of women's rationality and social conditions. Women should have access to a better jobs and choices of getting married or not. Although Wollstonecraft does not offer much to overcome the situation, it is possible to see that she already has a plan. In a few words, Wollstonecraft begins to formulate the subjects present in all her career in Thoughts on the Education. Let us move to the analysis of original stories and girls' education. Rather than Thoughts on the Education, original stories shows more alternatives to women concerns escapes of dependence. Wollstonecraft puts all her efforts into raising an education focused on developing girls' minds and bodies. It is important to emphasize that the protagonists are two girls, Caroline, 12 years old, and Mary, 14 years old. For that matter, the themes that compose original stories are compatible with the common conflicts in this stage of life. To the clipping suggested by this conference, I highlight two episodes present on this book. The first highlight is Mrs. Mason's speech to the young sisters about interdependence. According to Mrs. Mason, there are times in life when we can rely on others. It is not so bad because it is a dependence forget by the Heavenly Father and can help us call forth many virtues, exercise the best affection of the human heart, and fix them into habits. In other words, the interdependence that we can call positive promotes virtues of who helps and whom it helped. Unlike dependence, interdependence is a transitory situation and offers the possibility of personal improvement. The second episode that deserves attention is an Aloft case. Miss Loft is a mistress who lost her parents very young. Even though the story is very tragic, it's full of meaning. Used to have a comfortable life, Miss Loft sees herself as an anguished orphan after her parents' death. Who takes care of her is an aunt that I quote, treated her as if she were a mere dependent on her bounty, and expected her to be a humble companion in every sense of the word. End of quote. Seeing herself in this position, Mrs. Loft will try to find a way to achieve a more dignified life, as we will see ahead. The interdependence in the case of Miss Loft, it is important to emphasize three things. First, about interdependence, we can comprehend it alongside Wollstonecraft's idea about society. In Rights of Woman, Wollstonecraft will defend that society is the place where we can improve ourselves for the future. Thinking of Wollstonecraft's metaphysical framework, it is understandable that there are ways, such as interdependence, to develop ourselves through actions. Second, interdependence is helpful for society because the development and improvement of anyone in society is helpful. In Rights of Woman, this is an evident fact for Wollstonecraft. Everyone in a republic must be free to guarantee that the state is free. In this case, Miss Loft has under her aunt's domination what compromises the liberty of all the members of her society. Third, The kind of negative dependence that Mrs. Loft suffers is degrading both her and society. On one hand, Mrs. Loft is so dependent that it's almost impossible to escape the situation and develop her reason or have agency. On the other hand, her aunt must assume a position that is not hers. Instead of helping Miss Love to achieve other stage of improvement, this aunt has to think in ways to keep her dominations going on. In conclusion, interdependence is a positive situation when there is someone that needs help and there is someone that can help. Contrary to the case of dependence of women, in which is not a specific situation but a life condition. The first improved virtue and the second one degraded humankind. As shown above, original stories shows more example about the experience of dependence than thoughts on the education. Also, Wollstonecraft is more mature than the previous book, showing that she developed more of her observations about women's condition. Throughout Child Tales, Wollstonecraft teaches what she understands about dependence and why it is unacceptable. As we saw, dependence no longer improves, but instead makes humankind worse. In addition, Wollstonecraft puts much credit on society concerning the improvement of human beings. Maybe that is why she has an alternative to dependence. Interdependence is an example of improving ourselves and others when we help each other and exercise our virtues. The whole of society and its government is intermediate relations and promote their citizens. Moving forward, I will present Mary A. Fiction, a book that Wollstonecraft uses a lot of autobiographical facts to explore how female dependence can affect who suffers from it and who is around dependent women. So, compared to Thoughts on the Education and Original Stories, Mary A. Fiction is a book that consequences of dependence, female dependence, is more evidently. Also, Wollstonecraft sheds light on the consequences around the dependent person. I'll call attention to two characters of this romance, Eliza, the mother, and Mary, the heroine. First, the book presents Eliza as a gentle, fashionable girl. According to its presentation, Eliza, and I quote, was educated with the expectation of a large fortune, of course, became a mere machine. The homage of her attendants made a significant part of her puerile amusements, and she never imagined there were any relative duties for her to fulfill. Notions of her own consequence, by this means, were few superficial accomplishments without any taste for them. End of quote. As a fashionable girl, Eliza was raised and educated following the pattern of time. About marriage, who chose her husband was her father, and she readily submitted to his will, and promised to love, honor, and obey a vicious fool as in duty bound. When Eliza married Mary's father, Eliza continued to obey the same way she did with her parents, and consequently, she did not begin to think by herself. The difficulties that came with marriage were of different kinds. Domestic violence, Eliza taking care more of the animals than of her children, stillborn babies, and her nursing the nine. Only the oldest son and Mary could make it through childhood. The oldest son, Edward, was described as incredibly handsome. The heroine, Mary, however, is described as an awkward little blushing girl that Eliza would quickly send her away. Eliza's dependence has a strong influence in Mary's life. I highlight three consequences that show how the mother's submission impacts the daughter's development. The first consequence is directly related to Mary's education. Eliza does not carry her mother duties out. In other words, she does not prepare Mary to be a virtuous person, especially because it would be impossible. Eliza herself did not learn how to be this virtuous person, which includes learning to raciocinate and have agency. A second consequence is the lack of body strength, which results from how female bodies suffer in the educational process. The result is that women, in this case Eliza, are always sick and not feeling well. What makes it impossible to overcome her situation and try something different? The last consequence is a psychological one. Because of the absence of esteem between mother and daughter, Mary constantly feels sad and excluded. Looking now at the second character, Mary, she is refused by her mother, Eliza. Mary is raised in a natural environment and hindered to her imagination. According to the story, Mary was neglected by her family in every way possible. However, the situation turned out to be an opportunity for Mary to develop her emotional faculties. After a series of tragedies, including Elisa's death, Mary stays alone and she cannot count on any relative that can take care of her. During this struggle, the alternative is an arranged marriage. Mary's anguish about marrying a stranger is apparently throughout the book. This anguish feeling stays clear when Mary must deal with the emotions that she saw raised when she met Henry and has to deal quietly about it. After many narrators speaks about how marriage is an unfair arrangement, the romance closing phrase is, and I quote, in moments of solitary sadness, a gleam of joy would dart across her mind. She thought she was hastening to that world where there is neither marrying nor giving marriage. End of quote. In this story, Mary is a victim of a system that makes women dependent. Her mother, Elisa, could not help, a sign that the cycle of dependence continues. Maybe Mary fiction is gloomier compared to thoughts on the education and original stories. What I realize in this book is the possibility to comprehend that the extension of women's compulsory dependence. Compared to Education of the Rights of Women, Mary fiction can illustrate some of the affirmations that Wollstonecraft does there. For example, how humiliating in this dependent situation and responding to the conservative fear that women would abandon their families if they had intellectual growth. In the following section, and last one, I'll present some alternatives in thoughts on the education, original stories, and Mary fiction. Even though these alternatives are not proper to practice, they already offer some ideas that Wollstonecraft will develop in Education of the Rights of Women. The scholar Jane Moore noticed that Wollstonecraft uses the word genius to refer to women who think for themselves. Wollstonecraft committed herself all her life to be this new kind of genius, which independence could offer the possibility of thinking for oneself and the capacity for working and living freely for economic dependence. The concern about giving women the opportunity to work and be economically independent has many of meaningful episodes throughout Wollstonecraft's life. We can think of the possibility of getting a job that pays fairly as a kind of alternative to emancipation, but also only the idea of questioning the divine right of husbands is already the birth of social change. In each of these books, chosen to analyze the experience of dependence, I'll present one episode that we can read as an exit to the compulsory submission. Also, it is essential to say that the alternatives that Wollstonecraft drafts on her early books would appear on the Education of Rights of Women, more advanced in different degrees. So first, thoughts on education. Even though the conduct books were conservative in their intent, Wollstonecraft subverted the basics. I highlight two initiatives that we can look at as an alternative idea that can lead to emancipation. Countless motivation to develop the woman's intellectual faculties. Sorry, and first person writing. First, let us see how other conduct books deal with female reason. The prestigious Dr. John Gregory says on A Father's Legacy to His Daughters, I quote, wit is the most dangerous talent you can possess. It must be guarded with great discretion and good nature. Otherwise, it will create you many enemies. Wit is perfectly consistent with softness and delicacy, yet they are seldom found united. Wit is the most flattering to vanity, that they who possess it become intoxicated and lose all self-command. End of quote. As we can see, for Gregory, a clever woman should have discretion because men can feel dangerous when they see a woman with such talent. Contrary to Gregory, Wollstonecraft defends that an improved reason fills up the gaps in life, and the reason is the only consolation or satisfaction. I quote, "In a comfortable situation, a cultivated mind is necessary to render a woman content. In a miserable one, it is her only consolation." End of quote. Wollstonecraft has another observation about reason improvement, which means that reason is the only chance of our comfort here and the happiness hereafter. Her metaphysical framework assigns reason as the path to the soul's immortality. Moreover, it is the duty of all human beings to develop reason. Second, the right in first person shows that Wollstonecraft argues about how women should develop their reason and demonstrates the ability to hold this capacity. The first person writing is a well-known characteristic of Wollstonecraft books, such as the first and the second Vindication, and especially in Thoughts on the Education, Wollstonecraft argues and shows that women can write and think for themselves. Opposing Dr. Gregory, Wollstonecraft claims that cleverness is not a dangerous ability, but a necessary one. William Brody has an interesting observation about Wollstonecraft writing. Brody affirms that Wollstonecraft represents a double monstruosity because she's a woman that writes and the writing has politics as subjects. First, Wollstonecraft is a monster because she's a woman who dares to say how the men should deal with the word of politics. Second, political writing and rhetoric was a masculine field per se, because it supposedly requires virtues that are considered masculine, such as courage and masculinity. I'll quote Brody. When we accredit the act of writing the political essay as an agonistic endeavor that had always been interpreted as require mainly courage, we apprehend the anomaly of a woman writing argument. End of quote. Although Thoughts on the Education does not have a proper claim to suggest a political adaptation to include women in public spaces, it already demonstrates Wollstonecraft's demands to assimilate women in a field that is still less explored by women, the public speech. In the following subsection, I'll present original stories and another situation denied for women, the education for people. Emancipation alternatives in original stories are simplified throughout any Lofty life story. Previously, I mentioned the example of Lofty to explain the interdependence and negative dependence. Right now, we will look at how Lofty overcome her dependence situation. During Mrs. Mason's speech to Mary and Caroline, we realized how Anna Lofty conquered her autonomy. Mrs. Mason says that after Lofty analyzed all her possibilities to live, not include marriage, she decided to teach in the local school. The teaching job would provide her economic independence and possibility to make choices. It is essential to say that both Anna Lofty and Mrs. Mason shares Wollstonecraft's biographical elements. Mrs. Mason has Wollstonecraft's assertiveness, and Anna Lofty has the bravery to face complex events. Another thing that is important to note is that original stories has two essential elements: teaching through examples and two young girls as protagonists of learning. We can conclude that when there are examples such as Anna Lofty and Mrs. Mason, children can learn with stories and examples, especially girls, to search and build a life based on bravery and assertiveness. In original stories, she provides alternative lives for women. Wollstonecraft does not hide how difficult it is to go against what is proposed for women. However, she shows that there is always compensation. For example, although it is difficult for Anna Lofty to live alone with a teacher's salary, she lives happily and is also very proud of her students. According to the story, Miss Lofty can develop her reason and virtue. Also, she can dignify her heart. For closing this section, I'll present what we can learn about emancipation on the last book, Mary Fiction. I can anticipate that in this book, Wollstonecraft is more resignated about a situation of women, especially about compulsory marriage. As we read Mary fiction, the impression is that Wollstonecraft exemplifies some situations she mentioned in Thoughts on the Education. One example that I can give you is how the education of Elisa is described. As I presented earlier, Elisa is educated in a fashionable way, meaning that she does not develop her abilities to live freely. There are some consequences that goes beyond Elisa's life and impact directly her daughter. Even so, Mary can improve herself, but she cannot escape marriage. After reading Mary fiction, my impression is precisely that because her mother abandoned her, that Mary could develop her faculties. Instead of showing women that they can improve themselves alone, Wollstonecraft demonstrates that women are capable of learning and improving in the most challenging situations. And I quote Wollstonecraft again. As she, Mary, the heroine of Mary fiction, had learned to read, she perused with avidity every book that came in her way, neglected in every respect and left to the operations of her own mind. She considered everything that came under her inspection and learned to think. End of quote. Mary fiction presents some stories that show how a woman with a developed intellect is. Mary, the main character, always demonstrates that she can reflect and learn with the situations and discuss at the same intellectual level as men. Another upshot about this question is that an intelligent woman would not abandon her family and friends. Mary fiction shows that a woman who knows how to use her brain is perfectly capable of taking care of her beloveds. Because Mary knows her responsibilities, she would not abandon her role in people's lives. Women as caregivers are a point that Wollstonecraft greatly emphasizes in Mary fiction and rights of women. Especially in Mary fiction, Wollstonecraft exemplifies Anne and Mary's relationship. Anne is our heroine best friend, and she suffers from a disease that requires changing habits. Mary does not abandon her friend and provides what is best to ensure that Anne is cared for. Aware of the economic conditions of Anne's parents, Mary takes care of the responsibility to care of Anne. The conclusion is, in Mary fiction, is that Wollstonecraft exemplifies what she was thinking about women agency, independence, and most important, demonstrates that a woman who has a developed reason does not abandon her responsibilities which she cares about. And we are reaching conclusion. By the end of this presentation, we can ask me what it means to be free to Wollstonecraft. To a complete answer, if there is one, I will not offer you a response today because, as I said earlier, this is the central question of my PhD project. However, to start this investigation of the concept of liberty in Wollstonecraft works, it's inevitable to go through the experience of dependence and how this experience is vital to the narratives developed in Wollstonecraft's early books. My approach to this research is first to look at Wollstonecraft does not accept as freedom, preserving what I think is more original in her thoughts, the everyday life as elementary to the elaboration of her theory of rights and freedom. As I tried to argue today, the dependence has been cultivated in girls since childhood and grows in a way that pretends to be natural because there is no chance for them to develop themselves freely. Self-conservation is a vital strategy to develop early in life, and it is something naturally learned on times that does not have supervision. However, girls are always under supervision that keep them away from emancipation and learning to take care of themselves. The education they receive at home or school is responsible for keeping their condition status quo. Another essential point in this presentation that could be a whole conference is the theme of female body in Wollstonecraft's writings. According to Wollstonecraft, girls must healthily develop their bodies and rethink their consideration about beauty. The limited beauty concept common in Wollstonecraft's strongly imposed girls to have sedentary habits, while boys could run freely and develop their movements. This restriction is one of the first misconceptions of girls' education, once that a healthy body directly implies a sound mind and is capable of improvement. Dependence, as Wollstonecraft sees, is damaging woman and society. This kind of approach is an exciting way to demonstrate the collaborative whole of her vindication about women's rights. The question that I conclude my speech is, how can only a tiny part of society be free if the improvement of reason is a collective task? Thank you so much.